We're really pleased to have this panel discussion today on the topic of Black attorneys who inspired our panelists' career path. I'm Priya Kangura. I'm a 2L who's part of American Constitution Society, which is the organization that's putting this event together. And here at Duke, we're really lucky to have faculty serve as our mentors, and today we get to learn about who inspired those who inspired us. So I'll just give brief introductions, and then I'll turn it over to our panel. So we have Professor Jones to my immediate left. She focuses her scholarly research and writing on racial and socioeconomic inequality. She's a leading legal expert on colorism, which is the differential treatment of same-race individuals on the basis of skin color. Here at Duke, Professor Jones teaches civil procedure, employment discrimination, and a seminar on race in the law. And then we have Professor Charles. Professor Charles is the Charles S. Ryan Professor of Law, the Senior Associate Dean for Faculty and Research, and the founding director of the Duke Law Center on Law, Race, and Politics. He is an expert in and a frequent commentator on constitutional law, election law, campaign finance, redistricting, politics, and race. Among other courses, Professor Charles teaches constitutional law, election law, statutory interpretation, and race in the law. And then we have Professor Miller. Professor Miller joined the Duke Law faculty as a professor in 2013 after visiting in the spring 2012 semester. He focuses his scholarship and teaching on issues concerning civil rights, constitutional law, civil procedure, state and local government law, and legal history. And then we have Professor Coleman, who's the John S. Bradway Professor of the Practice of Law, the Director of the Center for Criminal Justice and Professional Responsibility, and co-director of the Wrongful Convictions Clinic. Professor Coleman's teaching responsibilities include criminal law, wrongful convictions, and appellate litigation. His academic work centers on the legal, political, and scientific causes of wrongful convictions and how they can be prevented. And if anyone has any questions at any point during the discussion, please feel free to raise your hand and interrupt. Thanks so much. I'll turn it over to Professor Charles.
All right, good afternoon. Thank you so much, Priya, for putting this together and to ACS. It's wonderful to be here and to talk to you on these issues. It's even more wonderful. It's amazing for me to be with my colleagues. I have never been on a panel with all of all the abundance, the fullness of all of my colleagues together, including ones that I have admired for a very long time, and ones that I have admired only in the last few years as I've gotten to know Professor Miller. But Professor Jones is someone for a very long time. When I was a student at Michigan, people would say, you have to get to know, no, only a couple years older. You have to get to know, and she looks like 5 years younger than I look. You have to get to know Trina Jones. You have to get to know Trina Jones. And of course, Professor Coleman is a hero of mine for a number of reasons. He has so much integrity, insight, and so it really is a distinctive privilege to talk to them about issues that matter to us and hopefully to you. And I'm so glad that you can make it. Now, just one thing that you have to do for Professor Coleman. He promises not to say a word unless the folks who are sitting in the back come on down. So come on down. Think of this like The Price is Right. Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it. Okay.
Without the money and the big wheel.
Definitely no money. We could put up a big wheel. That will help. All right, so let's just start with the question at hand. Just to begin with the overall question, which is lawyers that inspired you. Professor Jones, if you don't mind if I start with you, if that's okay. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the people who inspired you, especially to become a lawyer or to think about the law differently, particularly African-American lawyers that you found inspirational.
Okay, so when I was growing up, there were very few lawyers in my family. In fact, there were none. And so I didn't have any immediate influences of that sort that dictated that I go to law school and study the law. But my mom was a union organizer. And when she was organizing textile workers in the Southeast, she would often take me and my sisters along with her. And I got to see structural inequality up close from those experiences when I was a very young child. And that led me to study government when I went to Cornell for undergrad. And inevitably that led to law school, primarily because law was seen as a vehicle for economic security in my family. I thought about a PhD program, but there were very few role models for a PhD at the time, and therefore law seemed a little more secure. And so that's why I went to law school. In terms of people who influenced me from that point forward, I have to talk about Professor Coleman, because I landed in Wilmer, Cutler, and Pickering after law school, and Professor Coleman was there. I can't remember our first interactions, but he ended up being one of my primary mentors. And indeed, when I agreed to teach at Duke Law School, before I called my mom, I ran across the firm to Professor Coleman and said, I'm going to Duke. And then he sat back in his chair and he said, yeah, I'm going back too. So we're both here. What made Jim such a great mentor, and what I look for in terms of mentors, is the fact that he just instilled confidence, right? He was one of those persons who believed that I could accomplish things that I couldn't even foresee myself accomplishing. And so he, along with another lawyer named Max Truitt, assigned this case to me and just let me run with it, even though I knew nothing about the practice of law at the time, because you really don't know how to practice law when you graduate from law school. But they had enough confidence in me and my abilities to allow me to fail. They knew the sky wouldn't fall if I made a couple of mistakes, but also to allow me to achieve. And that's what's so special about Professor Coleman, both in practice as a mentor and I think in teaching law. I wanted to talk about two other people, if I may, just for a moment.
You're Professor Jones. You can do whatever you want.
If only that were true. Oh, my gosh. I had to point someone to the Supreme Court. Yeah, we shouldn't get into that discussion today. So you can think of inspiration as people who are from afar, right? So when I think of great lawyers, I think of Nelson Mandela. I think of Charles Hamilton Houston and Thurgood Marshall, who worked for the Inc. Fund and were the primary architects for Brown versus the Board of Education, as well as a series of other seminal cases in the area of civil rights. And certainly they have served as inspiration, but I also looked for inspiration in my immediate surroundings. So Professor Coleman served as a primary mentor when I was engaged in the practice of law. Let me see if I can get this. Uh-oh. Yeah. So I had one graphic, but apparently it's not going to be displayed today. There was another man in the law firm named Max Truitt. And while this is coming up, if it comes up, I will say a thing about mentors, right? Sometimes we think that we need to search for people who look like ourselves in terms of our demographic characteristics. So if you are a woman, you look for a woman. If you're an African-American, maybe you look for an African-American. What I found is that mentors come in all shapes and forms, right? And some of my principal mentors have been white men as well as African-American men. So don't be afraid to seek guidance from someone who may not look like you and someone with whom you may have very little in common. Just see. Sometimes the visuals don't work. It's coming up here, but it's not coming up there. So Max Truitt was the 63-year-old attorney, and Professor Coleman will remember him, in our law firm at the time that I met him. Gray hair, this gray beard, very imposing fellow. And we became really good friends, and he became a mentor of mine. The other associates in the law firm could not understand this relationship because there I was, this young African-American lawyer who knew nothing about the practice of law, and this imposing senior partner, one of the founding partners of Wilmer Cutler, Wilmer Hell now, and we struck up this relationship. In part because I pursued Max because I was on a big case and I wasn't getting any significant skills to speak of. Max had this lovely little morsel of a case that I wanted to work on, and so I went to his office and I said, I want to work with you. And I think maybe he respected that sort of assertiveness And so we started this working relationship. None of the other associates of my year could understand how Max and I were getting along. Indeed, they were terrified of Max Truitt, and yet I found him to be this very lovely, avuncular sort of figure. And Jim, you can push back on that if the characterization is inappropriate.
I agree with that.
What Max taught me, and unfortunately he died 2 years ago, was to be meticulous in the practice of law, right? And so there were times when I'd go into his office and I'd say, Max, I don't know if we can do X, Y, or Z. And Max would say to me, have you read the rules? And I'd look at him and I'd think, oh my gosh, read the rules of civil procedure. Are you kidding me? Maybe he was prescient and knew what I'd be doing in the future. But he was very meticulous. And that's one of the hallmarks of a good lawyer. You have to be careful. And Max instilled that in me. The other thing that he taught me, which I will carry with me to my grave, is that you must protect your professional reputation, right? That's all you have, and in addition to your skill, in this profession. And I remember one occasion when we were litigating a case. I was a young litigator, and I was caught up in adversarial zeal. And the other side had produced a document that was really damaging to their cause. So I ran into Max's office, and I said, look at what I found, right? This is great for us, even though we weren't supposed to have it. And so I said, we can do a lot of damage with this. And Max sat back, and he twirled his gray mustache, and he said, you've got to let them know that you have it, them being the other side, and you've got to return it. And I was like, what? No, we're going to use this document. And he basically sat down and gave me a lecture about legal ethics, right, and how important it is to be professional, to treat others as you would have them treat yourself, even in this very adversarial moment. So that's Max Truitt. So he taught me to be meticulous, and he also taught me to guard my reputation and to be ethical in all aspects of the practice of law. I feel like I'm talking for a long time, so maybe I can circle back to, that's Max. So then the other person about whom I will talk, could you keep pressing so we don't have any other issues, is Charles Beckton, who lives right around the corner. But I'd like to give my colleagues a little bit of time to reflect on some of their mentors and what they've learned from those people before I come back and talk about Judge Beckton, who is absolutely amazing, and you should invite to talk to ACS.
Perfect. Professor Miller?
So I'll keep it brief. Sort of like Professor Jones, I did not have lawyers in the family. My grandfather was a postman and a house painter. And my uncle, one of my uncles was also a postman, and another one worked in a factory. My father worked in a factory. The only other lawyer of his generation was my eldest uncle, second eldest uncle, David, who was had gone to the University of Michigan for law school and ended up being an assistant U.S. attorney. So I didn't have a whole lot to work with. My Uncle David would come down and talk about being in the U.S. Attorney's office, on Christmas and Thanksgiving, but I didn't get a lot of it, but I sort of soaked up those conversations with him during that time. I suppose in terms of sort of the mentors that I've had, I would echo everything that Professor Jones was saying, which is, mentors come in all different forms and shapes and circumstances. One of the people that I think I would say was one of my mentors wasn't a lawyer at all, but was a cousin of mine. He was actually my father's cousin, but he worked in a factory, but he had basically, he was really, really smart, or he is really, really smart. He's still living. He's retired now, but he had to sue for his job because at that time in Indiana, the only kind of position that was available in the plants for black men was to be a janitor. So he had actually brought civil case to get his position, which was eventually in a management position at the plant. And he was always sort of he had a lawyer's mind. He could see what the what the attitudes of the people in front of him were, what the sort of hidden agendas were, He was always very, very sort of meticulous, exactly as Professor Jones said, about sort of documenting things and thinking through about the best way to sort of advance his career. And even though he wasn't a lawyer, he was somebody who took the law very seriously, and I was inspired by him. I had really good conversations with him. We didn't agree on everything in terms of politics, but I had an incredible amount of respect for Cousin Eugene. I got into the law, in part because I liked. I really like the intersection of all the things that the law is, right? It's economics, it's philosophy, it's psychology, it's political science, and it's all brought to bear, right, in a really practical sense about what are we going to do, with our society? What are we going to do for this client in this case? And I had initially thought I was going to be a PhD in literature or history or something like that, and I decided that I wanted to do something that was far more practical because my father had a pragmatic streak, and I guess I come by it honest. And so I ended up going into the law, and some of my mentors in my life were people that I clerked for. So the judge that I clerked for, Judge Cole in the Sixth Circuit, has been an invaluable mentor. He, saw it as his role, because he had mentors himself, of sort of, sitting his clerks down and saying, hey, this is what's going on, this is why we're doing this. He was on the Sixth Circuit, so he was on the appellate court, which tends to be really monastic, and there's not a lot of action unless there's some sort of emergency appeal of some kind. And so one of his good friends was on the district court in the same courthouse, and he would tell us, hey, Judge Marbley is having a trial. You should go down there and see voir dire, or you should go see, a plea hearing or something like that, so that we would know it. And we didn't have any clue about why he was doing it, other than to say, if you sit there and you absorb and keep your eyes open and keep your ears open, you can actually learn a lot about the way the law actually works in practice. And he was quite attuned to that. Other than the judge that I worked for and these other sort of family members that were inspirational in terms of me becoming a lawyer and mentors to me in terms of my legal career, there are people in the sort of history books like Charles Hamilton Houston, which is a hero of mine. In part because Charles Hamilton Houston, knew that to be a lawyer, but to be a black lawyer, you had to be the absolute best, and that anything off of excellence was just not going to cut it. He was an incredible intellect. He had an incredibly fertile but strategic mind, and he understood the law in its most ethereal, but in its most practical. And when I was growing up, nobody talked about Charles Hamilton Houston. It was all about Thurgood Marshall, and rightly so, because Thurgood Marshall, was in the trenches. But if you want to think about somebody who was a true sort of an architect, as well as a true hero of the civil rights movement, I think of Houston.
Mr. Coleman.
Well, first of all, when I worked with Trina at Wilmer Cutler, and this is the truth, Max Truitt and I were the two partners on the case, but Trina actually ran the case and terrorized the two of us.
So not true. It's revisionist history. But I will not interrupt anymore.
I would have to appeal to her to take trips and stuff like that. Say, well, Trina, what do you think? Can I do this deposition? The thing about Trina was that she was really self-confident, and let me start there, because I think that's really the most important thing. That's the thing that I learned from lawyers I worked with, lawyers I knew growing up. I met Julius Chambers in Charlotte my senior year in high school, and I worked for him, reshelving books in his library. I basically was a gopher. But there were only 3 of us in the firm. There was Julius and his secretary and me. So, I sort of thought of myself as part of his firm, and I was as interested in the outcome of his cases as if I had been a lawyer. I think I learned integrity from him. I learned courage from him. I understood the importance of giving back. I think he could have been a very wealthy lawyer. He graduated #1 in his class at UNC, but he chose to go back to Charlotte and do civil rights law. The year after I left, when I graduated from high school, his office was bombed because of cases that he had brought in Charlotte, and yet he continued to work and continued until he died just a few years ago, being a lawyer. I clerked for Judge Damon Keith, who was a district court judge at the time in Detroit. And same thing. I mean, most of the lawyers who I think have been mentors for me have basically been cut out of the same cloth. Integrity was important to them. Reading the rules was important to them. They played by the rules, but they played hard. They were completely dedicated to the interests of their clients, and they didn't submerge that to anything, personally or professionally. And that's how I tried to structure my career. One of the things that I did at Wilmer was I made it a point to work with every African-American lawyer, actually every lawyer of color at the firm, because I always wanted to be in a position to say what I thought of their work. And I always told them what I told Trina, which is that it's really important to be self-confident, to take risks. One of the great things about Wilmer was that most of us were not specialists. I mean, we were generalists who did really interesting cases. So we were winging it a lot of the time. In order to be a successful lawyer at a place like that, you had to be willing to try to wing it. But I mean, we worked really hard to make sure that we didn't make mistakes, but you have to be willing to make a mistake and just hope that the people around you will catch it or catch you. I also had the great fortune of working with some just terrific folks. In addition to Julius and Judge Keith, John Pickering, one of the name partners at Wilmer, Jim Robertson there, Max Truitt, and then my best friend at the firm, John Payton, who was head of the Legal Defense Fund. He left the firm and became head of the Legal Defense Fund, and also died a few years ago. But John and I did a lot of cases together, and our approach was we got the firm involved in stuff that I'm sure some partners would have preferred us not get involved in. But we always treated the firm as our own, which I think is a good approach wherever you are, to treat the institution as your institution and not be an interloper. And we did that, and it was a lot of fun. We were able to do it with integrity, I think. So we're not stop there.
All right. Let me just I'll say a couple things about on my end. I didn't have lawyers in my family as well. I wanted to either be, I had basically 3 options. I was either going to be a preacher, a doctor, or a lawyer. I initially thought I was going to be a doctor because I wanted, I enjoyed that stuff and thought that I wanted to do brain surgery. I wanted to be a brain surgeon.
A preacher was out, right?
Well, preacher was out for a while, but then after a few science classes, I'm like, this is boring. It'll be a while before I could do brain surgery. So it was actually then it was down to divinity and law. So then divinity came back in. And realized, that was not my calling. So I went to law school. I wanted to be a civil rights lawyer when I went to law school. In the middle of law school, I realized I don't want to be an academic, but I wanted to be a civil rights lawyer. And I didn't really have a sense of what civil rights lawyers did, except that I knew about Thurgood Marshall. So that was sort of my vision. I tell people that the two visions that I had were Matlock and Thurgood Marshall. So if you remember the old Matlock show, where it's kind of cool, everything gets solved, all the legal problems get solved within a half hour or so. I understood the role that lawyers played as problem solvers, as social engineers, and so I had an intuitive sense about that, and that's how I saw what I wanted to do eventually. And so that was my vision. And the people that inspired me were not that different from some of the ones that you've heard about. So for sure, the generation of the Thurgood Marshalls, the Leon Higginbothams, the folks who, the Constant Baker Motley, sort of for me, there was a pioneering generation who opened the doors, the wholesale doors to people of my generation. So they were deeply inspirational, and I count, Professor Coleman and I clerked for the same judge. He at the district court level, and in my case at the Court of Appeals level. Judge Keith was just unbelievable, and as part of that generation, people for whom they had to work really hard for what they got. I mean, I think of Judge Keith and I think of Leon Higginbotham as sort of really interesting individuals. Eventually Judge Cole, but prior to Judge Cole. Judge Jones, right? Sort of people who, some of them went to historically black colleges like Howard and were formed there, but others of whom went to the Ivy Leagues, but who really had to break down the doors and the barriers, and their sense of racial justice is something that will always stay with me because it just exuded everything about them. And the other part that's interesting to me too is that not only they have a sense of racial justice, but they weren't bitter or angry people, even though they had a whole series of structural, individual, and indignities that they faced. And it is remarkable to interact with that group of folks who really had to work hard to get everything that they got and who faced a lot of racial injustice, but who maintain both dignity, magnanimity, openness, and I learned a lot from that generation, that it's important to also be thoughtful and open and magnanimous, even in the face of indignities, and how to deal with disappointment, how to deal with racism, and how to maintain the doors. I'll just say one last thing. When I was clerking, I don't know what you guys' experiences were, but when I was clerking, we were basically told, look, don't bother applying to the white judges because they're not going to respect your application. You're unlikely to get a job with them. The flip side of that is that the black federal judges really thought incumbent upon themselves to take the application of black applicants very seriously. Not just black applicants. You look at Judge Keith's chambers, he had everybody, white, black, Asian, et cetera. He probably had the most diverse group of law clerks than many other judges. And what was remarkable to me is how these black federal judges really did feel an obligation to the black students and the black law clerks. I remember interviewing with a number of them, and in many ways they were preparing the next group, their next group of mentees. And that's also a sense of obligation of making sure that you keep the door open for everybody. Not just black people, but for everybody. Keep that door open as much as you possibly can, and that will always stay with me as a formative experience from that time period. Let me stop there.
Can I pick up on something that you just said? Not only were these lawyers and judges distinguished by their graciousness, but I've always been impressed by their sense of hope. With Julius, with John Payton, they were in the trenches, and their lives were at stake sometimes when they were at times when they were litigating cases. Becton tells of a situation where they had to have highway patrolmen in the courtroom when they were doing voir dire, right? And when they won a verdict, they actually had to be escorted out of 2 counties, right, in order to avoid being ambushed. So they were litigating in perilous circumstances, but yet they not only were they gracious, they had the sense of hope that they would in fact change this country, right? And I think that it's really important to remember that in these times, because I have a lot of students who come into my office and they say, are we going to make any progress? And you have to look back at history, right? And look at the odds that they were facing and the odds that we're facing, and yet they never lost belief, right? That their actions would in fact lead to change over time. So it's that hope, that persistence, and the graciousness that I recall from these wonderful people that we've been talking about.
If I can jump in, so something Professor Coleman was saying, and he's an exemplar of this, came to mind with taking on civil rights cases and so forth, which is, I think it's important, that we're in a risk-averse profession. So people join the legal academy because they are a little bit afraid of risk. And that can be very, very harmful, especially for minorities and women in the profession. And one thing that I think I've learned is that to really succeed and be at the top of your game, you have to be a little bit entrepreneurial and you have to take some risks. And it's understandable because the risk-reward dynamic is different, because if you're black or if you're a woman and something goes south, then it's ascribed to some fundamental aspect of your racial character or your gender, as opposed to situational or whatever. But the concern is that to the extent that things are the generation before my generation, the generation of the Thurgood Marshalls and the O'Connors of the world, they had to be entrepreneurial because there wasn't anything else. Now, the fact that the barriers are a little bit lower can lead to a sort of passivity and allowing waiting for the work to come to you. And I think that if I was to sort of counsel my younger self, I would sort of highlight the fact that if you really want to succeed in being a lawyer, and you really want to succeed especially as a minority, that you have to take ownership, you have to deliver, but you also have to be a risk taker.
Yeah, I think that's true. When I started out, I wanted to be a civil rights lawyer too, but as a result of circumstances and time, and I ended up at a law firm. And I discovered, though, that I could be a civil rights lawyer there. John Pickering was an extraordinary lawyer. He was was an amazing mentor, role model for the firm. But he believed that lawyers had an obligation to the public and to the profession. And so all of us at the firm basically looked at our role that way. We felt that we had an obligation to be involved in public interest work. As I said, John Payton and I took him at his word. The two of us did a lot of work with John, and then John Payton and John Pickering together put together the Michigan Grutter, the affirmative action case, and John argued one of the cases in the Supreme Court. I mean, these were brilliant lawyers who never gave up, there was a sense of optimism about justice ultimately prevailing. And I've always approached what I have done as a lawyer that way. I mean, I do it now in the clinic. We've been working on a case for 14 years, and I keep telling the prosecutors that, we're going to work on it for another 14 years if necessary, but we're never going to give up because we think our client is innocent. We think, there was a miscarriage of justice in this case, and so why would we ever give up? Unless we change our minds about that. And I think that's kind of what lawyering is all about. At least at the top and the best lawyers, I think that's the approach that they take.
Let me invite you all to join as part of this discussion. And as you think of the ways of joining, let me add something that hasn't been put on the table. Also talk about peers as mentors. As well, because some of the folks that you will be working with or working with as peers, I think, are and will be exemplary. It does remind me that one of my peers when I was in law school is a woman named Jacqueline Coleman, and the last name is it's not by luck. It's the daughter of Jim Coleman. She was my moot court partner. Very, very smart, very dedicated, got her stuff done on time. We would have won the moot court that year had her partner been a little less, I will do things on my time when the brilliance strikes than the woman who does things 48 hours before it is even thought about. So I actually learned a lot from Jackie, from working with her, and I hope that some of her characteristics have rubbed off on me afterwards, because it was neat to work with somebody, have complementary strengths, and to recognize the places where you're deficient, and how to build on that. I didn't know Jim very well then, but it's very clear the characteristics.
Although I was more like you, Guy. I mean, I was sort of waited for brilliance.
and brilliance did come sometimes, just on its own time, unfortunately. All right, so please feel free to jump in, all of you. But what are some of the things that you want us to talk about as well, or some of the contributions or comments or reactions? Yes, Anna.
Jim, how does it feel for you to be named by your younger colleagues as an inspirational Black
Makes me
lawyer?
feel very old. I'm sitting here thinking that there are like 2 generations after me talking, and I'm sort of like that transition generation, because I knew people like Julius and Higginbottom, Thurgood Marshall, Fred Gray, who was lawyer for Martin Luther King. I actually had an opportunity to work with those lawyers when I was young, and I mean, I feel like my career has been vindicated in some way if it actually had that impact on some of my younger colleagues, including my daughter. I mean, I feel very good about that.
Yes, Francis.
Trina, could you talk about Becton?
So Becton embodies for me many of the same characteristics that Professor Coleman embodies: integrity, courage, good judgment, right? And I think that he exemplifies the fact that you can make a difference even in law school. So Becton was a student at Duke Law School. In his first year in law school, he met his spouse because they were picketing the Hope Valley Country Club because in her class, she was a freshman at Duke at the time, the class of 1966, which included 2 of the first Black football players for the Duke football team. And they were having their banquet at the Hope Valley Country Club, which was segregated at the time, so the Black players couldn't attend. So Becton went out in his first year in law school to picket and to protest, right? And he met his spouse there. But in his first year, think about that, right? In 1966, he's out there picketing the Hope Valley Country Club. Then in his third year, I'm not sure if you are aware that students, undergraduate students, took over the Allen Building in 1969, protesting the circumstances and the conditions for African American students on campus at Duke. Well, Becton thought that the students needed representation to protect their rights. This was in his last semester of law school, right before he was going out to practice law. Now, many people were thinking about whether they'd get bar certification and how this might reflect on their character. But Becton went over to the Allen Building and stood with those undergraduate students, right, to make sure that their rights were protected. After he graduated from law school, he began practicing law, and one of his first cases in 1971 was the Wilmington Ten Case. And this is a case involving 10 African Americans, 9 African Americans, and 1 white individual in Wilmington. At the time, there was a lot of racial tension because the schools in Wilmington had been integrated, and the KKK was marching down the streets, and the students were organizing a protest in response to the KKK activity, and a grocery store was bombed. And they accused the students of bombing this grocery store, and 10 people were in fact tried and convicted, and that some of their convictions was 282 years. Becton, 1971, 2 years after graduating from law school, was working with Jim Ferguson, one of the attorneys that Professor Coleman mentioned, to litigate that case in the midst of all of that racial tension. In addition to that, at the time, he helped with the Charlotte 3 case, which involved a situation where 3 young African Americans had been accused of burning the stables of an entity that had refused to actually allow these individuals to use their horses. So as a young lawyer, he was out there at great risk to himself litigating these really contentious cases. And I wanted to share what he said about one of his cases. I alluded to it earlier. This was the John Chambers case in Carthage, North Carolina. It was a high-profile case in 1973, 4 years after he graduated from law school, in which the first black police officer, who was 19 years old, on the Carthage police force, this very small rural town, in his first week on the job, shot and killed a prominent white business person. So just take yourself back to the early 1970s and imagine that scenario. The white businessman was reputed to be the head of the Klan. Becton took on this case and went and represented the black police officer. And he says, and I'll quote him, "They tried a wonderful case," and he said it was pretty clear to the judge, who, by the way, had his handgun on the bench throughout the trial, that they had a shot at a not guilty verdict, which they got. And then Becton said, "I was told that the judge was getting phone calls saying, if that N-word gets off, nobody is going to leave town alive." So the judge had 13 highway patrolmen line the courtroom when the verdict was announced. We, the defense lawyers, and the defendant were given a highway patrol escort, not just out of town, but out of that county and through the next county as well. So the courage, right, of this young lawyer. Becton's case also exemplifies that you can do well while doing good, right? Because he later became a judge on the North Carolina Court of Appeals. He's taught at Duke Law School on multiple occasions. He opened his own law firm, and then at the end of his career, after retiring, he became the chancellor at North Carolina Central University and at Elizabeth City State University. So he's one of those pillars in this community to whom you all have access, and he loves, like Professor Coleman, advising young people. So I would encourage you, if you want the sort of mentorship that we all have enjoyed, to seek out Becton. He wanted to be here today, but he couldn't come for counsel, because I think that he'd be a true inspiration to all of you, and he'd be more than happy to perform that service. He also cooks really good Southern food, and he often will invite you over to his house to eat. So if you're looking for a good meal, Becton is a source.
Should have started with that. I feel like I'm there already.
Could I just mention one other person, and that is Elaine Jones. Some of you may have heard of her. She was also head of the Legal Defense Fund, and was, when I was at the law firm, was one of the people who would constantly call John or me whenever something was going on and they needed the resources of Wilmer Cutler. I think they did it as much for the money as for the our legal skills, but Elaine was an amazing, well, she's still alive, but she was an amazing lawyer, leader of the Legal Defense Fund. She was fearless in the same way that the other people we have been discussing. One of the things that's changed now is that, you know, the lawyers then, some of the people we've been talking about, you know, it really took physical courage to do some of the things that they did. I mean, they were under physical threats. That's no longer true. And in some ways, it's what makes it more difficult today. You know, the sort of devil that they had to deal with was in front of them. They could see it. You know, it wasn't subtle. It wasn't sophisticated. And I think what's happening today is that a lot of the stuff that we have to deal with is more subtle, is, you know, more sophisticated. I don't think it's any less vicious. But, you know, sometimes, you know, that wears you down, and, you know, you just get tired of constantly having to explain to people, you know, the sort of complexity of what's happening today versus what happened in the 60s and 70s and even the 80s. But, you know, that's also a reason why it's important for lawyers who are interested in these things to stay committed to it, because I think the other side has sort of figured out how to wear us down, and you know, that it takes a lot of strength just to keep fighting some of the side battles that get thrown up sometimes, so that it appears sometimes that we're not dealing directly with, you know, some of the things that are undermining people. But I think it's important to kind of keep focus on what the real harm is that's being done, and to keep you know, keep trying to ferret it out.
You know, I agree wholeheartedly with what Professor Coleman just said, but there are plenty of opportunities for young lawyers to still get involved in situations where you might feel as if you're at risk, right? Black Lives Matter, they need good lawyers, right? Say Her Name, they need really good lawyers to help them. The battle for affirmative action, right? You might be maligned if you're representing the universities like John Payton did with the University of Michigan, or I think he also litigated Croson, right? Yep. Adirond versus Croson. So there are really contentious issues of the moment, right, that you could get engaged in, but it might take a little bit of courage, right, even today, because in our risk-averse profession, you might be fearful of the consequences if your ultimate goal is to be in big law or to be in politics. So I think that there's still room for courage, even though everything that you said, I think, is in fact the case.
No, I agree.
Did you have a question?
Well, it's kind of answered, but I mean, as an Asian woman who is also a foreigner, I think like sometimes I do face the kind of like subtle like discrimination or like prejudice that you all talked about, especially when people question your ability, not because like not based on your ability, but based on your like character, or like they think that it's because you are like a non-native speaker or because you're a woman or whatever. But I mean, I'm curious about like how do you build a community of like supporters? Because I really admire the Black community as like always you see like everybody is very united and.
Oh, that's not true.
Really? Like
No.
well, at least better than Asian community as I see it, and as especially now in light of the Officer Leon's shoot like conviction. I just wonder, like, how do you build a community, and how do you like face this kind of discrimination?
Well, one thing that I was probably remiss because both Randy Kennedy and David Wilkins, who were my professors at in law school, were mentors to me as well, and I also had the advantage of having David Wilkins, who studies the profession of lawyers and is a Black lawyer himself. And, you know, he said something that stuck with me a long time, which is, you know, the way, and why I was saying about entrepreneurialism is, you know, to get at the problem that Jim was talking about, which is not, you know, sort of the overt racist, but, you know, the fact that you're not popping up in the at the top of the list of somebody's mind is you have to do good work and be seen as doing good work, right? So the way that you get your name in circulation is by not sort of hiding your talents. So do good work and be seen to do good work, and then your name ends up at the top of the list as opposed to somebody that's further down. And I think that's and part of that is sort of creating the structures or networks that help that. So when I was in practice, there was a group of us who were minorities who thought, what we really need to do is we need to think about the position of the firm. We were associates, right? We were talking about the positioning of the business model of the firm in the 21st century. And we got together and said, all right, let's put together, a proposal or a plan about, how is our firm going to deal with the fact that there's changing demographics in legal services from a diversity perspective, and we put that together, and that was something that that I put together with an Asian American attorney that was that worked with me. It was taking other time, but it was something that was seen to be doing well and being a real contribution to the firm and taking ownership. And that's the kind of thing in terms of forming networks or communities that I'm sort of hinting at when I say about entrepreneurialism.
Yeah, if you're a good lawyer, one of the best things you have going for you is people who underestimate you. I've run into a lot of lawyers like that who, I've walked into a deposition or walked into the courtroom and they thought, that their day was going to be easy. And they regretted taking it for granted and never did it again. It used to amuse me to kind of watch folks, when you walk into the room and they see you for the first time and they think, oh my God, this is going to be a piece of cake. But you have to be prepared. You have to be prepared, and I think that's the key. You can't worry about what the other side or other lawyers or even lawyers in your own firm are thinking. The reason Trina did so well at Wilmer was because, she stepped up and was willing to assume responsibility. And I think that's really important. You can't just kind of hang back and assume that good things are going to happen to you, because they won't. You've got to be willing to put yourself on the line and just hope that you're working with people who will appreciate that and who will reward you for it. But even if they don't, it's critical that that's how you approach whatever it is that you're doing. And preparation is sort of the whole key.
I take your question seriously because when you're in an environment where there's a presumption of incompetence because of your gender or your race or your age or your national origin, it's hard, right? And sometimes the benign neglect that you experience where you feel as if you're invisible, right? In a particular space, it's really hard to thrive in those situations. And if there are overt comments, right, that makes it even more difficult. And what I would say is to try to build alliances, to build networks, as Professor Coleman was just saying, and Miller as well, even with people who may not have your same demographic characteristics, because you can't survive in these spaces alone, right, and really thrive. And the other thing I would say is to echo what Professor Coleman had said, and that is excellence is the best revenge, right? Just being good, but you have to position yourself so that you can be good, and that means that you need to have support structures in place. and it may entail reaching out to people, especially if there are very few people like you in a space who may be different from you, but who may have similar values, right? And building relationships with those individuals. And if you can't find those persons at Duke Law School, look at Duke University more broadly, right, in the graduate community. And if not at Duke University, look at other universities, because you will need people who believe in you, with whom you can confide in order to do your best, right, in these spaces. So it's a hard question.
Yeah, and I will just add very quickly, I mean, building intra and interracial coalitions, it's very hard, right? I mean, even the intra-racial coalitions are extremely hard. One, you can't assume that people who share your characteristics and demographics, whether they're Black, women, or whatever else, are going to also share the same point of view or interest. And sometimes one has to dissent as well, right? And so that's really hard. And building racial or interdemographic coalitions is very difficult as well. But that doesn't mean that the hard work shouldn't be done because of shared interests or shared commonality. And yeah, I mean, I certainly agree that, you know, one must do one's best to be excellent at all times. And part of it is that I think there is a cost to being different. Minority, otherwise, there's a cost to being different. And I don't think that cost can be avoided. And sometimes that really means that you have to be as excellent as you possibly can, knowing that you're not going to be always fully rewarded at all times, but I think it's the best thing that we have going. Let me just give you all a chance for a 10-second parting shot before we end this panel. So sum up your life's wisdom and 4 seconds, and remember that these folks are going to need to remember it for the next 50 years. 9 seconds.
Invest in the future, but live in the present. Right? So don't always be living your life for some distant objective, and don't be afraid to step off of the path that you've charted for yourselves. Some of the best opportunities will come when you least expect them.
Well, I think I would reiterate what Wilkins said, which is, you know, be excellent, do good work, and be seen as doing good work, and don't be afraid to take some risk.
I would say find a way to make a difference. Find something that you're passionate about and pursue it, and don't be self-defeating.
Be hopeful. That's it. Be hopeful.
The preacher.
Thank you.